Battling cancer is tough enough. Battling a rare cancer is even tougher. When our guest discovered a lump on his rectum, he thought it might be just a pimple. However, doctors told him it was a rare form of skin cancer. This is the Cancer Interviews podcast. I'm your host, Bruce Morton, and we're going to hear the story of Chris White of Dallas, Texas, and what he encountered when he learned he had mucosal melanoma. Now let's hear that story. And Chris, welcome to the Cancer Interviews podcast.
Thank you for having me on, Bruce.
Chris, we always like to start off from the same place, and that's to learn a little bit more about you, your life exclusive of cancer. So if you would, tell us a bit about where you're from, what you do for work, and when time allows for fun, what you do for fun.
Absolutely. I'm actually originally from Colorado Springs. In the 1988, I moved out to Southern California. I grew up in Orange County, and in 1996, I moved out to the Dallas, Texas area a week before my freshman year of high school. After graduation, I got my historical studies degree from University of Texas at Dallas in 2005. I worked in the service industry at a private golf club over the period of the next 10 years. So that was from 2006 to 2016. In between then, I also worked a little bit in oil and gas and also recruiting independent SAP contract consultants. And so after 2016, I got into new home construction and was doing that all the way up until about 2022. For fun, I snowboard, I skateboard, visit with my nieces and nephews. I currently, I do this for a living. I am an inspirational speaker and I travel around telling my story. So that's what I'm currently doing for a living. But when it comes to fun, anything that can give me a little bit of an adrenaline rush, hanging with my family is fun with me. And, pretty much it. No TV for the most part, cut all the cable off and everything. And so just try to visit with everybody. I attend a lot of conferences, symposiums, summits, anything in the advocacy world, cancer world, rare disease, rare cancer, cell therapy, and the treatment that helped cure me.
By the way, we're confident you'll be able to learn some tips and tools that'll help you through your personal cancer journey. But first, we'd like to invite you to please give us a like, leave a comment or a review below, and share this story with your friends. Kindly click on the subscribe button below and click on the bell icon, which will notify you the next time we post a new interview. And if you or a loved one are facing a cancer diagnosis, please click on the link in the description and show notes below to check out our free guide, The Top 10 Things I Wish I Knew When I First Got Cancer. Now, Chris, all of us who are cancer survivors had this very unfortunate, regrettable point in time, this juncture in which things seemed to be physically normal for us, and then they went from that to being physically abnormal. When did you first detect that something wasn't quite right?
Well, Bruce, in the beginning of 2018, I'd say right after the turn of the year in January of 2018, I noticed I had this little lump on my rectum, and I didn't actually do anything about it initially. I had heard about benign masses growing and moles in odd places and such, but it wasn't painful and it didn't bother me. And so I didn't do anything about it. Over the next couple of months, I recall snowboarding in March and sitting on the chairlift and thinking, this is a little bit uncomfortable. And then shortly after that, I ended up growing an additional lump in my inner right groin. And that lump grew tremendously fast. And so that was when I finally clicked with me, hey, I need to go get this looked at, see what's going on. But I did not connect the two different masses at that moment. But that's how it all got started.
But you did decide to get this looked into. And when that happened, what happened?
So I initially went to my general physician, and this, I believe, was around May or so of 2018. And he gave me an antibiotic. Yeah, it was a 10-day antibiotic, said to take these. If there's no change, come back, we'll give you another one. And I came back after 10 days, said there was no change. He gave me another antibiotic and said, after you're done with this one, if there's still no change, come back and I'm going to send you to a general surgeon and we're going to have him check you out. And so after those 10 days came back, I went and met with the general surgeon, and this was in June of 2018. He told me at the time he thought it might be a femoral hernia. He said it was extremely rare, but the only way to know was to do a surgery and to find out. And within that surgery, if it was a hernia, he would repair it. If not, we would go from there. And so I ended up having my surgery on July 2nd of 2018. And during that surgery, that's when he discovered that it wasn't a hernia, it was a lymph node. And so when I woke up, he had told me that, what had happened, but he had got clean margins and sent it to pathology. And so that was on a Monday, and I had taken the entire week off of work. This was the week of July 4th. And so I had an appointment scheduled to go see the proctologist to go get the other lump looked at. And that was on a Thursday, I believe, of that week. And the proctologist looked at it immediately and said, this does not look like a hemorrhoid, like I assumed it to be. And so that's when he asked, what was your pathology? And I immediately, my stomach sank, and I said, it hasn't come back yet. It should be within today or tomorrow. And he said, honestly, this looks like cancer. Once you get your pathology, let me know and we can go from there. And then it was the next day I got the call.
Now, with everyone, the equation is a bit different. A cancer diagnosis has different levels of severity, and each person is different in terms of their past and their present. Once you got that diagnosis, Chris, what was your reaction?
I was shocked, very much stunned. It was paralyzing, because when they called me and told me, that yes, this is confirmed cancer, but they told me it was a metastatic form of malignant melanoma. It is extremely rare. It is not skin cancer. And, to make a phone call to the oncologist and see them immediately. And this was on a Friday afternoon, like around 3:00. And so I had about an hour to make this appointment. So I hung up the phone with him and made the call to the oncologist. Let me rewind just a second. Prior to hanging up, he actually had told me, until you make your appointment and you talk to the doctors, because this was, the weekend was showing up, he had told me to not research it, Dr. Google, or to let my family know, because it was going to cause more confusion, and they're going to ask more questions than I had answers. So I don't recall necessarily, researching it myself, but I did let my family know so I could have somebody to come with me. But I was able to get the appointment for that following Tuesday morning. And at that appointment, they were telling me that, this is an extremely rare, they're trying to figure out, what specific type this was. They were looking at pathology, that had got me to that diagnosis. But immediately at that very first oncology appointment, they told me that this is very specialized. It is extremely rare and you need to see a specialist. And so they asked me, if I wouldn't mind doing that. They said MD Anderson is in Houston. I live up in the Dallas area. It's not, terribly far of a drive. I said, absolutely. And we made the calls, and I started making my way so we can go see the specialist. But I, the sense of urgency that they had when I went to that very first appointment was so intense. It made me realize how extremely rare it is. Later I would come to find out that, it makes up 1% of all melanoma. So for every cutaneous or skin cancer patient, there's only one of me. So it was very, very humbling.
Did you find that you had treatment options? Not all cancers allow for treatment options. What about your case?
Well, when I got down to MD Anderson, there is no known cause for my cancer. So, they have to basically, reverse engineer or look at what has worked, in other certain cases. The 5-year survival rate is maybe about 14%. And so you told me that the first thing that we should do, after, PET staging and everything would be immunotherapy, which is a targeted therapy that's not a chemo therapy, that's not a radiation or anything like that, but it is a treatment that is given to you via IV, just like you would a chemotherapy treatment, but it doesn't give you all the side effects, but it is designed to specifically use your immune system to attack it. So he said, we're going to go ahead and do that. By the time I had got down to MD Anderson, I had also had a second surgery on my primary. So I had, my first two initial surgeries. So he said, once we find out, exactly, where you are with staging and everything, we can move forward. So I did a PET scan, and they told me the first thing that we should do would be what's called a lymph node dissection surgery. And so they put you under anesthesia, they shoot a dye throughout your lymphatic system, and it sends, this kind of, it lights up through, like a map, throughout your lymphatic system, and it can kind of show where the cancer has possibly spread to or not, and if there's any existing left. So they end up pulling a decent amount of lymph nodes out of both my right and my left groin, and then there was a little bit of remainder melanoma that was further up my colon, in my rectum, that they couldn't see initially. And, I had these tubes sticking out and everything. And so, the line of treatment options after that, they said, would be targeted radiation. And then we were going to go into a chemo plus an immunotherapy, or a combination of immunotherapy. But essentially you have immunotherapies, chemotherapies, radiation, surgery. And I didn't know this at the time, but also TIL therapy. But you have to, qualify for it. It's very specialized. So, but there's not many known treatments. It's all guess and check.
Chris, you mentioned immunotherapy, chemotherapy, and then a few minutes ago you brought up a word that really struck a nerve with me, malignant. From the emotional perspective, the emotional piece of all this equation, how daunting was that? The prospect of undergoing chemo, but the thought that perhaps battling this cancer may not be confined to your rectum.
That's a very good question. I didn't actually know what the word malignant meant when they told me that. So I was oblivious to it, to be honest. I had no clue. The only thing I had known about cancer prior was just what I had learned from watching movies and everything. I didn't know and really learn of everything I know now until about a year or so after I had finished my treatment in 2020. Actually, it was probably closer to 2021 or so until I started really learning about everything. But, chemo, they told me from the get-go, would not be any treatment. It would be the last on the list. It would be a Band-Aid. It would be something to use just to maybe stabilize or to kind of keep it at bay. But chemotherapy was never going to cure this type of cancer. It was never going to, go to remission or anything. The type of cancer is so far aggressive that chemotherapy was a last ditch choice, and so, immunotherapy was always the very first, go to. And so it was, I was kind of ignorant to it, to be honest. So, I just kind of went with the flow.
Because this was a rare sort of cancer, there were probably, and I might not be making the best word choice, there might be some innovative or creative ways of dealing with it. Was the prospect of something new and different, like a clinical trial, something that entered the equation?
It did, but since I had got down to MD Anderson, the clinical trial that I probably initially would have done would have been the one that I eventually did do. But at the time, I didn't actually have visible metastasis anywhere. So in order to do the treatment that I actually did, you have to have more than one tumor of a minimum size so they can extract one and then monitor the other. And when I got down to MD Anderson, I had my primary tumor removed from my rectum and then my secondary tumor removed from my lymph node. And so it was that following surgery after that they pulled, all my lymph nodes and the remainder of the treatment out, but that was off the table. So the clinical trials that were going down there were a mix of the immunotherapies with a chemo or an immunotherapy with radiation. So that was considered a clinical trial. So I actually did, some of those as well. But the very first time I went to go do my staging after that third surgery, I did a PET scan to figure out where we're at, and I was supposed to go into a chemotherapy plus an immunotherapy combination clinical trial. But that's when they discovered that it had metastasized from stage 3C to stage 4, went to my lungs, lymph nodes, and and other lymphatic system. And so I immediately went on a combination immunotherapy.
And how daunting was that to find out that your cancer had spread to your lungs and elsewhere?
You know, I was even more shocked, and that's when it really hit home, because when I went in for that meeting to go over my scans, I thought, I maybe had just a little bit that was still left in my groin. I could kind of seen a few lumps that looked like sunflower seeds, and I had done a ultrasound right before my meeting. And so I had confirmed that there was still a little bit in my groin. So I was thinking to myself, okay, maybe there's a little bit, we'll attack this hard. And so when they told me it had metastasized everywhere, I was completely shocked. I mean, it literally like threw me to the ground in a sense. And, but I immediately was able to pick myself back up and, just say, okay, what's the plan? What are we going to do? Let's do this immediately, not tomorrow, today.
Now, you, Chris, are in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. MD Anderson, a world-class facility, is in Houston. So you're logistically somewhat nearby. But I'm guessing with all the speaking you've done, you've encountered other people that were diagnosed with mucosal melanoma or other rare cancers, and they were not as logistically fortunate as you. What are some of the barriers that people face in your experience with what you've learned? What are some of the barriers people face who have rare cancers, rare diseases, and world-class help is not close at hand?
Well, one, the more rare it is, the harder it is to find both, a facility that could treat it, a doctor that's familiar with it, let alone another patient that could advise you about it. And so all of that, all comes into conjunction. When I first was looking up mucosal melanoma, there's literally almost nothing out there that was, positive or anything. It was all out of date, and it was very grim and everything. And so, you really got to get into your recruiter type mindset of, searching and tracking down, where these facilities are at and where these kind of treatments are at and everything. But a lot of the barriers is that, if nobody's talking about it, nobody's going to hear about it. And so, it's, the internet has these algorithms and everything. So it depends on, what you're searching for, but it's, there's only a handful of places, that are, actual specialists. Now, there's a lot of doctors, that deal with melanoma. You can find those everywhere. But when it really comes down to specifics for mucosal melanoma, it's like when I was in recruiting, you don't want to have somebody that's a jack of all trades and a master of none. You want a master of one, somebody that specifically deals with it. And so, you just start reaching for referrals. Some of these facilities require you to do an initial consult in person. Some of them, you can do online. You have to maybe do some local examinations, everything. I was fortunate enough, even though I went down to MD Anderson, which was about a 4-hour drive for me, I did all of my systemic treatment, immunotherapy and chemotherapy here in Dallas. And so they would, I would go down there and do my scans, and I did my surgery down there and my radiation down there. But when it came to doing the chemotherapies that I ended up doing and the immunotherapies, I did that all up here in Dallas. And so I was able to get both my oncologist here in Dallas and my oncologist in Houston to communicate. And that right there is one of the bigger challenges, because not all doctors everywhere are familiar with this process and are open to doing it. There's insurance barriers, if you're out of state, that comes across. And we learned a lot about this during the COVID era. A lot of the restrictions were let up during that and everything. But now that, a lot of that has passed, we're back to where it was before, where, if insurance can't figure out how to bill, then you can't really have a consult. Some people literally have to drive over, to a parking lot across state lines sometimes so they can, do a Zoom call from their phone to do a consult. Financial barriers is another one. Since these are specialists and everything, insurance oftentimes, can turn down or deny or delay, whatever it is the treatment is that your oncologist is prescribing. So I tell everybody, I always ask them to do a peer review. If there's any kind of let ups or, hang ups on anything. That way they can, literally hear it from it, because when you're trying to get insurance approval, it's literally somebody sitting at a desk with a chart that's never, not familiar with it, going, well, this chart says that no. And, you're fighting for your life saying, well, the doctor's saying yes. So, I mean, there's a lot of things like that.
Now, as you recount your story, you're sounding pretty upbeat so far, Chris, but what you had to go through sounds, as I said, to use the same word again, sounds rather daunting. What was the toughest part of the treatment as you look back?
When I metastasized early on in my journey from stage 3 to 4, shortly after that, I ended up having a lot of cancer-related pain. And so I was put on what I would later come to find is called a comfort pack of pain medication. And so I might tell people, imagine how high you can fly when you feel like Superman. But I was on a fentanyl patch. I was on the maximum amount of hydrocodone you could take per day. I mean, I was pretty lit for the majority of the entire time that I was going through everything. And so my whole mindset was like, if I'm going out swinging. I'm going out to where people aren't going to think, remember me as being all doom and gloom and stuff. And so, I also got some energy from the pain meds, weirdly. And so I was ready, and, I had to advocate for myself, for sense of urgency when it came to appointments, sense of urgency when it came to treatment. I was not willing to settle for wait and see. I was not willing to settle for whenever, their appointment was, like 2 weeks. I said, no, tomorrow, and, I, reminded myself, I'm the patient. I'm the one who's paying the doctors. They work for me. All right. And I wasn't going to let any kind of, doctor ego or anything come to that. It was, this is my life. I am, not just going to sit down and let things, just fall to the side in the hands of somebody else. I really took about a year after I had metastasized until I eventually did get into my clinical trial that did save my life. And the whole process is where they extract a tumor, send it to a lab, and then they take that specific tumor. They do not alter it, but they just grow it into the billions. Okay. And then within that time frame, it's about a 22-day period, and then they give it back to you intravenously. Well, right before they give it back to you, you go through about 1 week of chemo depletion to bring your white cell count down to 0. So that way, when they give you your TIL, it's like Pac-Man that goes throughout your body, and it's a blank slate, and it eats up all the cancer like all the little dots and cherries. And so right after they give you the TIL, they give you IL-2 to activate it, and that's up to 6 doses. And so the whole process was about, this is a 2-week, deal on average, if not more, in the hospital. But from beginning to end, from signing consent until doing your surgery for your extraction, and then waiting for them to grow your TIL, getting into the hospital, being monitored afterwards. I mean, it's at least a month process. And so right before I actually entered the hospital after I had got my surgery, which ended up being, by the way, an additional surgery to my right groin, because I had another lymph node that grew in that exact same spot. So now that's the third surgery to the exact same spot. And I was clinically declining. I thought I had a cold, and I went into the doctor to go, hey, can you give me some sort of Z-Pack or steroid shot or anything? And they said, Chris, you're getting into a clinical trial. We can't do anything for you. We cannot alter your system. There's very strict rules and everything. And so I did my baseline scans, and I went in for that appointment. And at that appointment, they told me I had a brain metastasis. And so it kicked me out of the trial. Things were looking very grim. I was not looking good. They had actually told me to call hospice and settle my affairs might be a better option for me. They said that this was in Dallas. They said they had talked to the clinical trial coordinator that was in Colorado, where I was going for my clinical trial, and that the only way to get back in was to stabilize the brain metastasis and show it to either be stable or in reduction. And so, but the thing is this clinical trial was a phase 2 cohort 4, and it was closing. They had an end date. And so, and they weren't, going to wait for me, and hold the door. So I, had to make it into this trial. But in order to get in to have the baseline scans and everything, that was also on a strict timeline. And so they said, okay, you need to do targeted radiation to your brain metastasis and everything. And so, but you have to get insurance approval. So, we started making the calls. I went ahead and had a visit with the radiologist. And, the radiologist, said, yes, we got to do 5 sessions and everything. We're going to do targeted SRS to your occipital lobe. But, we need to make a mask first. And so, but they could not even schedule the appointment to get my mask made until they had insurance approval. So it actually, I was told this information on December 10th of 2019. It took 6 days to get my insurance approval. Right after that, on the next day is when I got my mask made on the 17th. And then on December 18th, I started doing the radiation treatment. Well, the very last day for me to scan was on December 24th of 2019. And that's only actual 4 business days. So I ended up getting all 5 sessions done in those 4 days. And then I scanned on Christmas Eve. And then I had to wait until my appointment to get back to Colorado, which was on January 3rd. So between that time, I was filling out my end of life, will, and everything that goes along with that. And just, really trying to keep the vibe as positive as possible during the Christmas time, and just believing that, I was going to make it. And so I flew out to Colorado on the 2nd, and I met with my oncologist on the 3rd, and she told me what, was probably like the best moment of my life ever, which was that the radiation had worked. It is considered stabilized. It actually had pseudo progression, means, it goes up before it comes down, but it was enough to prove that it had worked and they had let me back in. And so this was on January 3rd, 2020. I was admitted to the hospital on January 8th, 2020. I did my week of chemo depletion. I was dosed with my TIL on January 15th, 2020, and then followed up by 6 doses of IL-2, and then released from the hospital on January 20th, 2020. And so, I had my first follow-up scan 6 weeks later at the end of February. It showed that things were working. And throughout the year would continue to come in, eventually went from 6 weeks to 3 months. And about 9 months later, I think it was August or September of 2019, I ended up showing a complete metabolic response. And then exactly 1 year to the date from when I went into Colorado in January 3rd of 2021, we did an additional PET scan just to confirm 100% that I did have a complete metabolic response, and I've scanned clear ever since.
Our guest is Chris Wyatt of Dallas, Texas. He's a survivor of mucosal melanoma. And Chris, I want to turn this in a more positive direction and ask you if you were 100% pre-diagnosis. These days, how close are you to 100%?
I've been 100% since that date I just mentioned to you, January 3rd, 2021. So
you're back out snowboarding now?
Oh, I've been snowboarding, yeah, since I went back in 2021. Every year, absolutely.
Excellent. Excellent. Chris, want to ask you about one more thing before we wrap up, and that is that you had mentioned that you are an inspirational speaker. And there are various things that you do to get your word out to others. If somebody wanted to find out more about you and what you're about, your story, that sort of thing, is there a place they can go on the web?
Yes, sir. Absolutely. My website is mucosalmelanomasurvivor.com. My social media handles are at mucosal melanoma or at mucosal melanoma survivor. It depends on which one you're going to.
Excellent, Chris. And our final question is the final question we ask of just about all of our guests, and that is, if you encountered someone who shared with you that they had been diagnosed with this very rare form of skin cancer, mucosal melanoma, I'm sure there are probably a lot of things you would want to say to them, but if you can pick out one point that you would want to make sure you got across to that person, what would it be?
Sense of urgency. 100% sense of urgency. This is extremely aggressive. Do not take it for granted. It is your worst enemy, and you need to treat it like so. So be extremely aggressive. If whoever it is that you're, communicating with or working with has that same sense of energy, then you're in the right place. But if they're not, you need to go find somebody that is.
Excellent. Chris White, Dallas, Texas, thanks so much for sharing your story. Thanks for being with us on Cancer Interviews.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Bruce. Appreciate it.
And that's going to wrap up this edition of the Cancer Interviews podcast. And we'll remind you, as we always do when we wrap up, that if you or a loved one are on a cancer journey, you are not alone. There are people out there just like Chris White who have information for you that can be informative and inspirational. So until next time, we'll see you on down the road.